a lot has been written about evangelicalism from a sociological angle, or a political angle, a historical angle, or a theological angle. But what about things like literature, fiction, art, poetry, and popular culture? How have those things formed the evangelical landscape? Well, that's what Karen Swallow Prior's new book, The Evangelical Imagination, is all about. Let me tell you what I thought. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I have here an advanced copy of Karen Swallow Prior's new upcoming book. It's coming out this summer as I record this in 2023. It's called The Evangelical Imagination, How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. And I want to say, before I get into the review, thank you very much to Brazos Press for sending me this for review. Okay, I'll go through my typical format of the main idea, the research, the readability, and the reaction that I had to the book. The main idea of this book is pretty well encapsulated, I think, by what I said at the very, very beginning of this video in the intro. Karen Swallow Prior is looking at the kind of hidden, maybe previously unexamined values that have shaped and formed modern evangelical culture by way of popular culture, music, fiction, art, popular writings, all that kind of thing. And more specifically, she kind of lays this groundwork in the very opening pages of the book. Her kind of primary argument historically is that evangelical cultural values and even some of our ethics are predominantly informed by Victorian culture. Actually, she has a line in the beginning of the book that evangelicalism, and I think she's quoting someone else when she says this, evangelicalism is more Victorian than it is evangelical, at least as it's come to kind of be shaped in kind of the current day America in the West. So that's kind of the kind of premise for the whole book, is that Victorian values really have dictated a lot of evangelical values, and those things have been mediated over time through all the popular culture stuff that I just listed off. Music, books, poetry, so on and so forth. So that's kind of what the evangelical imagination is about. And then she takes from that premise, she goes through a thematic study, chapter by chapter, looking at lots of different themes, like the theme of religious awakening, the theme of domesticity, the theme of empire. There's a chapter on eschatology and the end times, and several others that I haven't mentioned. So she looks at each one and then does a little bit of a thematic study on how this particular value or ideal was shaped, particularly through popular culture that reaches back into the Victorian period. So that's what this is about. And Karen Swallow Prior is an expert, not coincidentally, in Victorian literature specifically, although this book reaches out beyond just literature, which leads into my first thing to say about the research. This, in a way, Karen Swallow Prior is, I think, the perfect person to write this book, because she is, her area of academic expertise is Victorian history and literature, and her personal experience is a deep experience in evangelicalism herself. And she's known as someone, in some of recent writings about evangelicalism, she's known as someone who's argued for kind of a reclamation of the term. She's arguing for holding on to the term for some historical reasons. And so she's coming at it from that angle. But her research here pulls obviously a lot on her expertise. There's a lot discussing things like John Bunyan. Jane Austen, of course, shows up. A lot of stuff comes out of the Victorian era that she knows very, very well. But she also knows popular evangelicalism very, very well. So she's able to quote current songs, she's able to quote more recent fiction, and she's able to draw those connections, I think, quite persuasively when she is trying to pull out these ideas about how these certain things have been shaped as an inheritance from the Victorian period. And so the research is very solid on both counts, current day popular stuff and the historical stuff. She also, it must be said, she pulls on not just the popular things like Uncle Tom's Cabin or Pilgrim's Progress, but she talks about, for me, as someone who's pretty well read, but not necessarily at all an expert in Victorianism or Victorian culture, she pulls out some stuff that's quite obscure, that's quite revelatory, honestly, in terms of its explanatory power. She also does a lot with popular sermons that were preached in the Victorian period and since, which is very, very helpful. So research is very solid, and like I usually like to point out, in the case of when this happens, it's very easy to chase stuff down on your own if you want to learn more about a particular topic. And one thing that's nice about books that are organized like this in a thematic way is that if a certain chapter grabs you, you can chase the footnotes down and really learn more about what she researched to kind of pull that research together. So really solid, really solid. Not a surprise at all coming from her. She's a very thoughtful and serious academic person. Okay. But then the readability is the next question. Okay, is it readable? And yes, this is very readable. It's a very approachable book, and it's written particularly to be approachable, and the thematic study helps in that way because each chapter almost reads like a contained essay on the topic. And so I prefer to read books cover to cover given that, but someone could conceivably skip around in this book and read particular chapters and topics that are of interest to them. So it's very approachable, very readable. The chapters are not overly long. The references to popular culture are very easy to understand. And when she does get into her academic expertise, she makes the connections very clear and very, like I said, very approachable. It's easy to grab, kind of get handles on the arguments that she's making. So very readable book. This would be, I would say, someone who doesn't read a lot, but is interested in the topic, and even if you're not a Victorian expert, very, very easy to get into the argument that she's making, very easy to understand the case that she's laying out. And so finally, that goes to my reaction to this book. And you can probably tell at this point in the review that my reaction to this book is very positive. I really appreciated this book quite a bit, with one, I don't know if critique is the right word, but one kind of concern I would bring up that I'm going to get to in a minute at the end. But I want to talk about what I really appreciate about this book. First of all, probably the most important thing is that this is a really distinct and unique book. And I alluded to this at the very beginning of the review, but there are piles and piles and piles of books being written about the state of evangelicalism, kind of a lot of hand-wringing about what is evangelicalism, what does it mean to use that term, how has it been formed, and how has it been shaped by different historical and cultural forces. I mean, there's just so many books seemingly continuing to be written about that topic. And I'm fascinated by the topic, but I must admit I'm getting a little maybe fatigued by the numbers of books and the different topics that are kind of being approached. And yet, even despite that kind of fatigue that I'm starting to experience, this book struck me as very fresh and refreshing because it is a different angle. The angle of the imagination and the hidden cultural values is really helpful. She uses the analogy at the beginning of the book about like kind of the bones of a house, so to speak, the studs, the things that hold up a house that nevertheless are not explicit or seen, is what she's trying to uncover. And I really like that image, and I think that way of getting about trying to define evangelicalism is really helpful and really different. I also must say something else that I really value about this book is she engages, I didn't mention this in the research section, but she engages with philosophers like Charles Taylor, and if you watch this channel, you know I'm a big Charles Taylor fan, but she engages with his concept of the social imaginary, I think, in a very helpful way, and brings that to bear on the argument she's making about popular culture, which has, in her argument, formed a social imaginary that evangelicals occupy. I found that all very persuasive, very helpful, and also, like I said, a very different angle on a topic that's getting a lot of attention these days. So super positive, big positive there. Something else I liked are just certain chapters I just really liked. I thought that her inclusion of certain categories was very smart. She very smartly distinguishes, for example, between religious awakening and religious conversion. Those get two different chapters, which I can see a lot of other writers conflating those into the same experience, but they're quite different, and they come from different cultural values and different roots. I loved the chapter on sentimentality. I loved that she has a chapter on the value of testimony and storytelling, and seeing where some of those things come from in Victorian culture was really eye-opening. I love the chapter on domesticity and what that brings to bear on things like gender roles in the kind of, and also the nuclear family ideal unit in a lot of evangelical rhetoric. I love the chapter on empire. I thought that was a really smart inclusion here, and she draws on particularly the infamous poem of Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden, and then brings kind of the value of empire and Victorian England to bear on the conversation about race and some of how that conversation is fraught within evangelicalism. It was a wonderful chapter. Really, really grateful that chapter was included in the book. So there's a lot of great chapters there. that are really valuable and have a good bit of explanatory power in the sense of figuring out kind of where these things come from and how they're cultural inheritance from a particular era in history. So that's a lot of positives, and I do really appreciate this book. I do want to wave kind of one criticism, maybe? I don't know if criticism is the right word for this, but the subtitle of this book is How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. I approached this book with that subtitle in mind, thinking like, this is going to be really interesting to see where some of these metaphors and literary influences have created evangelical culture. And I was hoping for some sort of cohesive argument about, here's the crisis that exists in evangelical culture as a result of these cultural values. Here's how these various forces like domesticity and empire and eschatology and awakening and conversion and testimony and all that stuff, here's how these things create tension from each other, and here's how these things are creating ruptures and a crisis within evangelicalism, especially as it relates to things like politics and race and all these topics, gender, that are broiling right now. This book doesn't really go there, and perhaps that's an issue of unfair expectations, although I would argue that I think the title and subtitle, especially that subtitle, create the expectation in the reader that there might be some tying together of all these thematic ideas, and it doesn't really happen. She does in specific chapters at the end, she goes into a few paragraphs at certain chapters saying, here are some inbuilt tensions and problems with this particular value, like in the chapter on domesticity, she gets into some problems with gender roles in the family system expectations. For example, in the chapter on testimony, she talks about here are some problems with valuing dramatic stories as conversion narratives and such. So she does critique, she does offer critiques. However, I guess what I'm saying is I wish that there would have been leaning a little bit more into, here is the full-blown crisis, here is how all these values have created a full-blown crisis in evangelicalism, and here's maybe some thoughts about how to wind these back. Here are thoughts about how to get to the root of some of these cultural values and to replace them with different ones. And that argument doesn't really happen. Maybe that's a follow-up book. Maybe that's a different book. It's not this book per se. This book is, however, so if that's, to the extent that that's a critique of if you go in expecting that and find it not there, as I kind of had that experience, that's a little bit of a disappointment. However, I do want to end by saying what this book is, if you take this book purely on what it is a very smart, very well-researched, very coherently argued exploration of invisible cultural values that have had a lot of formative power in modern-day evangelicalism. That's what this book is. It's an exploration and a diagnosis of where these things come from historically. And to that end, it's really successful and very illuminating and a very distinct book within the publishing on evangelicalism today. And to that end, I really highly recommend it, with some of those caveats I just mentioned in my slight critiques a minute ago about diagnosing now the crisis and where do we go from here. Perhaps that's missing and perhaps that needs to be another book, and I would love it if she would decide to write that. I think that would be fascinating. But there you go. Those are my thoughts on the upcoming book, The Evangelical Imagination by Karen Swallow Prior. Highly recommend it, given everything that I've just talked about. And if you especially are interested in any of those influences, if you're interested in Victorian influences, or if you're just interested in modern-day evangelicalism and where these values come from that aren't strictly doctrinal, theological, so even sociological, but you're just interested in culture, man, this is a great book, and it's really worth a spot on the shelf next to a lot of other books that are wrestling with the same topic. So hopefully that was helpful to you. Hopefully you'll find a book that will take up some of your time and energy and be worth reflecting on because of what I'm doing here. But regardless of that, I, as always, wanted to say thank you for taking the time to watch.